Underneath the Oversea by Mark Laidlaw. Chapter 1. The Headland. On a bluff above the sea lived a gargoyle, a tree, two bards, and their various children. As for the adults, the gargoyle was Spar, the songwood was Sprit, and the bards were named Gorlen and Plenth. A family, they had occupied this beautiful meadowy mound above the ocean for about 6 years. Although they had not the slightest desire to move, they were soon to be relocated by events so strange it would take a book to explain, on the very last page of which there might still remain questions unanswerable. Now, a certain sort of reader might ask, why even mention the bards? Why bring up a gargoyle and a songwood grove? Aren't these minor figures in the much bigger story of a truly significant personage? Well, as the saying goes, history belongs to the singers. Bards have an undue influence on how events are remembered, and since there were two of them, it is quite possible the real hero was simply outnumbered. Thus, it is their account that enters the record, distortions, misrepresentations, inaccuracies, and all. The two musicians, Gorlen and Plenth, had a daughter named Aiku, whose other father was the gargoyle Spar. Aiku took after all three of them. She had one of her father's clear green eyes, and her other father's other eye of polished black stone. Her green-eyed father was Gorlen Visenfirth, an Eduldamer player renowned for his clever style of left-handed strumming and plucking, while his right hand, made entirely of black gargoyle quickstone, went sliding and slithering all up and down the strings, making shivery sounds. Aiku's black-eyed father, like all the goyles from his quarry, was formed entirely of shiny black quickstone, except that is for his right hand, which looked like the one Gorlen should have had. It was flesh. In fact, Spar and Gorlen had switched hands long before Aiku was born, for reasons never clearly explained to her. All she knew was that she shared features with both, while from her mother she got her rosy fair skin and her fine lustrous hair, in color somewhere between brown and red and gold. Plenth herself had violet eyes, which Aiku would have preferred to black and green ones, but unlike her father's with their opposite hands, she knew of no way to swap eyes with her mother. The remaining children inhabiting the bluff, a dozen or so, were sprouts of Sprit the songwood tree. Sprit so loved the gargoyle Spar that her offshoots displayed occasional stone-white traits, such as every now and then putting out shiny black leaves that looked just like rock until a breeze flexed and fluttered them. Aiku was the only one of the children who could run and play, but she was just as likely to spend her day pretending to be a sapling, rooted in the shade of her songwood siblings, one of whose favorite games was to see if they could trick her into running errands for them or otherwise cause her to betray that she was not truly a tree. Aiku possessed enough innate gargoyle traits to easily stand motionless for hours on end with her feet shoved in the soil. Sometimes she grew so still that when her songwood siblings swayed in a sudden wind, it caught her by surprise. At these times she resembled Spar more than Gorlen. Even her mother Plenth, coming suddenly out of sunlight into the shade of the songwood grove, might mistake her for a small pale boulder among the roots. Called by name, Aiku quickly flushed pink again, supple as a willow wand, but Plenth foresaw the days when an irritable adolescent might not soften and stretch and come so eagerly to greet her. Having no memories of her own parents, and no idea what to expect, Plenth found her joy tempered with trepidation. The bluff on which they dwelt was really more of a brow, the crown of an actual headland. The great head's lidless eyes were partially uncovered at extreme low tide, and Plenth sometimes found herself imagining how in earlier ages these vast orbs in the now buried face might have gazed watchfully across the mudflats. The broad, steep forehead had been worn away by storm and salt, opening thousands of pores to be freely inhabited by countless generations of cleric birds, whose antics her daughter loved so much to watch. Gyring flocks of lofty, white-headed prelate birds, their wings spread wider than a young songwood's branches, soared high above the grassy crown. The prelate birds never touched land or things of the land. They hatched upon the waves from buoyant eggs, slept among bobbing kelp flowers, and hunted in the atmosphere exclusively, feeding on salt moths and sunbats, forsaking even fish once they had fledged. Their black-billed cousins, the lesser clerics, on the other hand, nested all along the rock above the sea, where they scribbled notes on scraps of papery bark stripped from marsh reed and traded the messages back and forth from hole to hole, squabbling noisily as to the meaning of each, or so it appeared to Aiku. With a black ink that flowed from their crops, they would strike out another bird's scrawl and overwrite it with their own, making insertions and interlineations, correcting omissions, squabbling all the while. They were marvelously careful with their beaks, and almost never tore or perforated a scrap, despite scrawling violently on both sides. Once each note had been thoroughly attacked and just as thoroughly defended, its original author went winging out over the sea, carrying the surviving message to other colonies of cleric birds somewhere beyond the horizon. Birds from foreign colonies arrived at every daylight hour, with their own avian epistles scrawled on subtly different species of reed bark. In appearance, the visitors could be easily mistaken for locals, but Aiku had learned to distinguish them by their exotic brands of stationery. At low tide, the mud flats below the cliff were covered with cast-off notes, thin reddish parings, thicker green strips with a backing so tough they could only be scribbled on one side, and long skinny twists like broken springs, suitable only for aphorisms. Aiku gathered the most legible ones and brought them back up to the grove to see if anyone could read them. Her father Gorlen said they were probably meaningless, but her father Spar said they certainly had meaning to the birds. There were many languages, Spar said, even if most were spoken only by those raised speaking them, whether bird or beast or fish or even tree. As evidence of this, the songwood saplings almost never ceased their murmuring, only some of which Aiku understood, even though she had grown up among them. Sprit, towering at the center of the grove, surrounded by her sprouts, saw the girl's occasional confusion and took care to speak so Aiku understood. But her saplings were not aware their fleshy sister felt excluded. The notion of isolation was meaningless to them, being connected at the root level to one another and to their mother. Someday, though Sprit did not like to think of it, the grove would require thinning. Her children would have to be dug up, their roots carefully severed and separated from their mothers, then replanted somewhere farther out on the broad grassy outcrop where they could flourish more freely in sun and shade of their own. That way, on a day even more distant, the whole headland might be lively with trees and so many voices, a dream that delighted Sprit in this age when songwood groves had become so rare. Few remained unharvested in their indigenous homes. Untouched, old-growth stands were a thing of songwood legend. But still, the thought of being separated from her offshoots worried her, especially because none of her extended family, flesh or stone, showed any particular talent for gardening. Sprit appreciated that Plenth and Gorlen had made several attempts at raising enough food to feed themselves and their daughter, but neither of them had an agricultural inclination. Lives spent on the road as itinerant bards had not exactly ingrained in them the skills suited to a settled existence. They were accustomed to eating whatever inns offered, purchasing only what they needed to get from hearth to hearth, earning just enough to subsist in this manner. Neither bard was apt at domesticity, and of course Sprit and Spar had little to share in the way of relevant expertise. Spar's needs were nil, while Sprit got all she required from the sun, soil, and clouds. In retrospect, it would have been wiser for Plenth and Gorlen to pair up with partners of a more practical inclination, but all this had been sorted long before they made their way to the grove atop the headland. Having established their little homestead, they were still trying to figure out how to make it self-sufficient. Gorlen and Plenth continued to play music for a living, the difference being that now they traveled only as far as Twadrille, just up the coast, with its busy port and thriving urchin market, overnighting there a few times a month, entertaining merchants, travelers, and sailors, then returning home with enough supplies to get them through a week or two in the grove. When her musical parents went off to play, Aiku stayed behind in Spar and Sprit's care, which was fine when Aiku was in a stony mood. But she was flesh after all, and frequently restless in the manner of that kind, and Spar must always be alert to the possibility of her straying. Being alert was no problem for Spar. For the most part, he spent his time perched on the ridge above the sea, scanning the horizon in the manner of gargoyles and guardians everywhere. As was also typical of his kind, he felt a constant sense of menace, of unspecified ominous events in the offing. Were these genuine portents, or simply the manner in which stone-wights invested their lives with meaning? Certainly there were no visible reasons for concern, apart from the usual threats to all defenseless creatures. The ocean kept its secrets deeply hidden, but in the skies above, life and death were conducted in plain view. When they first came to the headland, Spar had watched what he thought were prismatic veils of rain drifting slowly across the sea, falling from hazy luminous clouds that drifted here and there in the wind. It was only when one of these gauzy veils suddenly darkened, coiled, and dragged a squirming Titanacle from the waves, lifting it up and stuffing the struggling behemoth into the maw of the luminous cloud, that he realized he had been admiring a predator and not an atmospheric effect. The Prelate birds, which generally ruled the clouds, were careful to avoid these shimmering drifters. The face of the sea could change expression wildly from one hour to the next. With each shift of wind, the waters whipped up frothy peaks or abruptly smoothed out into rolling knolls. At the highest tides, the cliff was skirted with foam, and the cleric birds shrieked whenever their notes were splashed by a particularly violent burst of spray. On calm, sunny days, Spar could hear the clatter and scratching of beaks upon paper, and he looked forward to taking Aiku down to collect the most interesting scraps from the mudbeds below. Aiku, despite her single quickstone eye, lacked her gargoyle father's continual sense of imminent threat. She was quick to laugh, slow to worry, and disinclined to focus on immaterial things. She appeared in most respects a very human child, although this was perhaps an obvious point, since there were no other gargoyle children who hadn't been carved that way. Spar had not fathered her in the usual human manner, though his contribution was undeniable. Gorlen was the fleshy father, but because Gorlen carried a part of Spar, a portion of the Goyle's traits had passed to their daughter. It meant Aiku's gestation was a matter of more than a decade, and no mother had ever delivered a child with such a sense of relief as Plenth had. After the first 5 years of pregnancy, she had begun to believe no babe would ever be born, and when Aiku eventually emerged, pink and perfectly fleshy except for that quickstone eye, she immediately had to suppress the thought, "All that for this?" They had come to the headland by then, and were settled into a little cottage restored for them by a local carpenter, one of the few who did not take fright or offense at the way the songwoods glared when he arrived with loads of fresh sawn boards. Sprit and her children had been there waiting for Spar to return from his long wandering, and wooden Sprit appeared unsurprised to see her beloved stone-wight arrive, accompanied by 2, nearly 3, creatures of flesh. Almost immediately after reaching the headland, Plenth came to term, as if something in her or in the child had needed the security of friends and family before anything else. Once born, Aiku grew at a rate that was more or less typically human. After 6 years on the headland, Aiku passed for a 6-year-old, although occasionally some goylish mood might come over her and she would briefly seem as ancient as the earth. Spar displayed something like pride at those moments. Their cottage was set back from the cliff, surrounded by a garden of attractive flowering weeds. Their little home was spacious enough for Gorlen and Plenth and Aiku, but they spent as little time as possible inside it, rarely closing the windows when they did go in, except in the worst of winter. The songwoods were wonderful company. Plenth and Sprit conversed constantly about things both mundane and musical. Plenth wanted to learn as many of the songwood standards as possible, to see if she could adapt them to human instruments. This dream had ended dashed from many a musician before her, but she was in an ideal position to succeed where they had not. She was disciplined, she was determined, and rarest of all, she could call a songwood sister. As for Gorlen, he loved their little house by the grove above the sea, loved everything about it, that is, except the sea, whose distant crashing kept him awake and full of foreboding, even as it lulled his wife and child to sleep. He had grown up in a similar house on a similar coast, and the sounds of the ocean since childhood had distilled in him to a single drop of dread. He had lost his family to the wallowing depredations of a massive rutting shore beast whose approach was masked by the rhythmic roar and thud of waves. There was no possible threat of this upon the towering bluff, but still always the old nightmares waited to wake in the dark. He took to daytime napping. Sprit quieted the children whenever Gorlen settled against her trunk, strumming his Eduldamer ever more slowly, eyelids lowering. "Hush now, my sprouts. Let's give the Flesh-Father sweet dreams." And Aiku would lie on her belly watching him with her chin in her hands as her siblings sang lullabies around them. And Plenth would gaze out the window to see Aiku and Gorlen lazing in the shade of the grove and go back to tune her own Eduldamer. And Spar would squat at the very brink of the headland's brow, knowing his family to be safe at his back while he watched for ill omens, waited for warnings, which of course, as they always do, came.